So Kit Colbert, CTO for VMware Cloud at VMware, obviously. So my focus is really on everything infrastructure related at VMware, and a lot of the related concepts and topics, modern applications, what we're doing with Tanzu and how that's deeply integrated to what we're doing with VMware Cloud, how we're taking all the different infrastructure offerings that we have, whether it's in the public cloud, service providers, in the data center, at the edge, and really bringing them together to a more of a unified whole. So that's really what I focus on. Talk with a lot of customers, talk a lot about multi-cloud strategy. So kind of, all over the place a little bit in this area. It's a lot of exciting things happening, a lot of really good conversations. I will say, just for the last one real quick, that's a great point around the VMC integrations. I think you're right. We don't call those out enough. And it's a good call. It's a good point of feedback for us to do better there, because there is actually a lot of work. And I will say, behind the scenes, a ton of effort looking at how we can make VMware Cloud on AWS seem more like a native AWS service in those ways. I kind of just mentioned IAM integration, CloudFormation, et cetera, et cetera. So this session we really wanted to be pretty open-ended. Just ask me anything. We'll see what I can answer. I've been thinking a lot about multi-cloud lately and having a lot of conversations around that. One of the things I'm finding really interesting, and I'm seeing some debate about this, by the way, on Twitter and various blog posts, is whether multi-cloud should be a strategy or whether it just becomes sort of an inevitable outcome. And I wrote actually a post about this maybe a month or so back. And I see a lot of people arguing that, hey, you should be going singular cloud, that like having a single cloud, you can standardize on it. It allows you to standardize your application architecture and the services that you use and your operational processes. And I think, that there's this kind of nice simplicity to that, which, I totally agree with. Like, that is pretty awesome. But what I see when talking to customers is that there's so many reasons why that doesn't happen, right? That there's an acquisition, they're using some other cloud, or you just have shadow IT still happening, or that the cloud that you standardize on isn't doing as well in a certain area, and that maybe for, I don't know, machine learning or whatever, you got to go to somewhere else. And so it's an evolving dynamic space. And what I've found, I'd love to hear from you guys how you're seeing it, is like multi-cloud seems to me to become inevitable, and that you will eventually get there whether you want to or not. And so given that, it's best to have a strategy. And so what does that strategy look like? So I've been thinking a lot about that. So I'd love to talk about that, or happy to talk about VMC and AWS or anything else. So I'll open it up after that very short opening.
I'm glad you brought that up. I'm going to pose to you a scenario that I have been hearing from my customers a lot recently, and it's directly revolving around multi-cloud, and there are some phrases in there, and they've been posing me this question, and I'm curious. So these are large, Fortune 100 customers that have, a large on-prem VMware environment, and they are looking at multi-cloud. And invariably, what I will hear is, I want to take advantage of cloud-native services, but also still have the capability to move my workloads around with ease and facility. And I have my opinion of the expectations around what that means and what they're going to run into when the rubber hits the road. I'd like to hear what your positioning is on that.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. They kind of want to have their cake and eat it too, so to speak. Want the best of all worlds. So I think, there's kind of a general thing and then a bunch of specifics that I can get into here. So on the general side, and I laid this out in the blog a little bit, is that there is no one size fits all in terms of multi-cloud. There's a variety of ways to approach it. And the real question becomes, if you look at, let's just say, a stack, like where do you draw the line of abstraction at, right? That at this level of abstraction, it doesn't really matter what's underneath that, right? It could be different. So let's say, by the way, if you look back in history, what enabled VMware to be so successful early on was the standardization on x86. If there had been like 1,000 or whatever, 100 different processor types that were all mutually incompatible, we would have had a lot harder road to plow there. And what made it successful is that, we could kind of, we could make that abstraction powerful and then give you that sort of portability across. And so then the question becomes, what happens next? And so, we're seeing some people maybe, glom onto things like Kubernetes as an abstraction layer. And the Kubernetes kind of abstracts over the specific core IaaS, that's underneath that, right? And so some people use Kubernetes as a way of saying, okay, well, my apps are, the runtime, the compute at least, is fairly standardized, and now I can get portability between clouds. But anything on top of that might not be. And that could be what you're just talking about here, these kind of higher level services, right?
Right, exactly.
And so then it's a question of, well, do you go kind of full PaaS, as it were, and have this app in a completely controlled environment with, very specifically architected services? So, and then, you can go up or down from there. So I think in general, that's like the big question to answer. And the point is that there's no really one right way to do it, that each of those have trade-offs. And I think you can get in some ways close to getting the best of all worlds, but there's always going to be some trade-offs. So that's the first thing. So more specifically, I think what we're looking at here is some interesting innovation happening in the industry. So first of all, we VMware are partnering with many of the public clouds on delivering their services in other places. So you look at things like our partnership with AWS around RDS and running that on vSphere. And so you can imagine that now as a capability. I want to use RDS, and now I can get kind of RDS anywhere, even on non-AWS environments, on top of vSphere. So that's like an interesting one that I think you could play that out and see where it goes. The other one that's interesting is looking at the ISV space, whether it's Mongo or Confluent or just to name a few, Redis. Like there's a bunch of these folks out there, and a lot of them are moving toward delivery of their capabilities as a service. Snowflake is another big one, right? And these things run across any cloud as well. And so there you could say, okay, I can standardize on that service, but still get the underlying cloud portability. So it's not a panacea. There's always going to be some trade-offs there, but I think the industry is working toward how do we get toward the best of all worlds. Maybe not all the way there, because again, there's still some very practical trade-offs you have to make. But that's kind of how I see it.
I appreciate that. That's actually almost word for word the exact same answer that I give to my customers when we go down that path. So nice to hear we're on the same page.
Well, like I think my dad would always say, great minds think alike, and so do we. So
when I think of multi-cloud, I think VMware's kind of missing out on an opportunity here. You've got a lot of solutions that you've developed either first party or with partners to get your SDDC into multiple hyperscalers. Wouldn't it have been easier, maybe not for VMware, maybe not for the hyperscalers, but for the customers, if you just made the VMware hypervisor a choice when going into the cloud? If I want an EC2 instance, it can either run on Amazon's hypervisor or VMware's that's already running on there. Nothing to manage, not even an SDDC. There's some kind of multi-tenancy built in. I know VMware has solved for this with their smaller cloud providers. I don't see why you couldn't solve for it with the hyperscalers. And then you actually do have a true multi-cloud fabric, including on-prem. No format changes needed. You can move workloads between on-prem to any number of clouds. Sure, there are all kinds of constructs to figure out around that, around networking and storage and whatnot. But surely we have faith in the engineering might of the hyperscalers and VMware combined to accomplish this kind of mobility much more easily than requiring me to stand up an entire SDDC to move workloads from one place to another.
Okay, so let me make sure I understand the question. Basically, you're saying, so today there's essentially kind of a two-step process, right? The first step is I need to create an SDDC somewhere and specify a whole bunch of properties about it. And then I can go and create the VM or the workload on top of it. I think, and what you're saying is, well, can we kind of remove that first step and just focus on the VM creation, and that we can handle all the specifics of creating SDDCs or managing them or whatever? Is that kind of what you're saying?
You're on the right track, kind of what I'm saying. I'm not even talking about necessarily creation, but like mobility of VMs even.
Okay.
Between, if we're talking multi-cloud, whether we're talking about it being the right cloud for the right use case or truly having mobility between different clouds, couldn't we enable that by having the same fabric on all these clouds, which would be a similar hypervisor, I guess. I know there's much more to a cloud service than a hypervisor, so I know that there's much more to software there, but that's just kind of a thought I've been having.
Yeah. Well, I guess again, maybe I'm not understanding. I think I mean, from what I'm hearing you say, it sounds like we do have that. I mean, you know, you can spin up an SCDC on any of these clouds, and you then have, you know, using HCX portability across them. But I still think there's something that I'm not understanding.
There's a huge, you know, barrier to entry with that, right? I mean,
okay. So
the largest of the large enterprise customers can do that pretty easily if they have the amount of workload that large of an amount of workload.
Got it.
Not
got it. Okay, so you're saying, hey, like, in order to get an SCDC, it's, you know, 3 nodes, or, you know, 2 nodes now actually, and those, you know, pretty beefy nodes, at least on VMC and AWS, like an i3 or i3 EN, and that upfront cost would necessitate a certain number of workloads that you're going to move over. And you're saying, hey, if I just want to move a few, then that upfront cost probably isn't justified. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, that's definitely part of it.
Okay. Well, look, I mean, I think taking a step back a little bit. So what we're doing with VMware Cloud is definitely a little bit different than what the public clouds are doing, that model. And again, it goes back to that sort of 2-step thing that I mentioned before. And, you know, in the public cloud, you can just go and get a VM, and that's fine. There's VPCs and all the things you can build on top of. And the reason that we went with the model that we went with for VMC and VMware Cloud more generally is because it mimics what people have on-prem, in the sense that, you know, that they have access to vCenter, they're managing things, and it's all kind of single tenant infrastructure, you know, not sharing a physical host, all that. And so, you know, we want to focus on consistency of the operational model between the cloud and on-prem. And so because of that, like, you know, we have things like VCD, for instance, that service providers use, and that kind of obscures the underlying vCenter, allows for better sharing. You can create a single VM if you want. So you can get that model. But the problem there is that it's a different operational model. So you have that sort of incompatibility. And so that's, you know, why we did it. Now, you can get into more specific and say, okay, well, within that model, how can we make it easier, right? And how can we make it easier to start up? And we're absolutely going down that path. You know, we went from 4 nodes as the minimum and VMC and AWS to 3 nodes to 2 nodes. And there's still like a 1 node. It's a temporary option, I think, like a 30-day trial type thing. So, you know, and over time, we will get more node types, and they'll be smaller, bigger, you know, GPUs or whatever. So we can lower that cost of entry. So, you know, I think the model is powerful because it allows people to so quickly and easily move their workloads and use the same operational tooling, skill sets, people, et cetera, they had before. And so that for us, I think, you know, won't change. Like, we got to keep that there. But we're going to add more flexibility in how you do that. So that's the second part. Then the third part is really coming on top of that and providing more of a public cloud-like consumption surface for developers and other sorts of folks. And, you know, leveraging VRA and some of these capabilities, you can then give that more of that single VM sort of self-service thing. So you're right, Ken, there is still that sort of startup kind of overhead, if you will, today. But I think for many customers, it's not too much of a problem. And again, it matches their operational model. Then the final thing I'd say is that we do have folks that are working on this, right? Like a lot of our partners, our VCPP partners, address this, you know, again, using VCD. So you can actually start much smaller. So, you know, I think we have some of this. I still don't know if I'm exactly answering your question, so I apologize. But hopefully I give you some context as to, you know, why we made sort of the architectural decisions and design decisions that we did, and the value props of them.
No, thanks. Appreciate it. That helps.
Well, I guess it's my turn then. So it's in a similar way, my question. So for example, VMC is co-designed and basically deployed with VMware and AWS, the collaboration. But we know that other VMware clouds like that are verified by VMware, which is slightly different, but still runs, and it's the same vSphere that we know. Now, I agree that multi-cloud is the way to go, and there are many benefits, and the workload should be going to the cloud that should run in, and whatever your strategy device is. Now, when customers want to go to 2 clouds, I'm currently working with one, and they're trying to decide between VMC and AVS, basically, based on their workloads. So sometimes some companies want to do that. Now, if they end up having both or three or more, HCX is a way to migrate workloads, but it's not a permanent solution because you're migrating. Is what I'm thinking of now is that would VMware ever consider saying that having a super migration layer, if you like, that if those clouds are added as endpoints, you effectively sort of vMotion between all of them. Is there something like that coming, or can you think that happening at some point, even though those are Google clouds effectively or Microsoft clouds, but because it's a customer that wants to have that ability, it could be HCX underneath, but having a management layer on top that allows them to move workloads from one place to another. So truly unifying that one cloud experience.
Are you thinking about this as kind of like a giant virtual cluster across all these clouds or something? And it's more like a DRS type use case where they just kind of auto balance
between the different, so the provider doesn't matter then. And your workloads move across because it's owned by a particular customer, but then they have the ease of use and move and running as well, wherever they want to run it.
Yeah. So we're not looking at anything exactly like that today. I think what I go back to is the use case. Like, what's the use case for? Like, why would a customer want to do something like that? I could imagine them saying, "Hey, we need to be in multiple regions or multiple parts of the world, geographies, and maybe these different providers have the locations of their data centers happen to be perfect for us, right?" But even in that case, is it really going to be a constant load balancing thing? Like, would they really need that? Because keep in mind, like, there's costs to this stuff. Egress charges, you're replicating data, especially if it's a big VM. It can take a while to send all that stuff over. So there's a cost there. And so, it's eminently doable. Like, we have all the underlying capabilities to do this. The question, I think, is, what we look at as a use case, right? Like, what's kind of driving that use case? And then, we go and talk about it. And like, is this the right way to go solve that? So that's kind of how I'd approach it.
Exactly. The reason why is that, it's more about ease of use of the customer. So for example, if it's not a permanent migration, it's like you're moving workloads for a particular reason. So, and again, I know that it's not a use case that would be pretty common and everyone would like to do it, but what everyone does like is having a single layer where they can manage whatever they have. And that's what I'm getting at. And again, it's a hypothetical question, of course, but the point is that, is this something that you can ever see VMware doing? Because the session is Ask Me Anything, right?
No, it is, yeah. I think if there's a strong customer use case that would necessitate that, then sure, yeah, we can go figure it out. Again, I think like a lot of times the devil's in the details though. And it's like, what are they really trying to do? And is this really the best way to go and do it? And, what we find is when we talk to them, like sometimes it's a much simpler solution and it's totally fine there. If you're saying, hey, like it'd be easier to manage, well, what's the manageability challenge today? And let's go see if there's an easier way to go address that, right? So I'm not against it. I'm just saying, like, I tend to try to really hone in on the problems that we need to solve and then figure out the right solution for it.
All right, thanks.
So I have a question regarding application migration into cloud native, because VMware is VM centric for the most part. I know there's Tanzu and other things that are kind of shifting that ball, but because VMware has such intimate knowledge of the applications that run today, I feel like you're in a unique position to build a migration platform to help organizations onboard to cloud native. So is there anything in the works or anything you're doing to help that progression?
Yeah, absolutely. So a bunch of stuff, actually. And, to your first point, yes, VM is what we do. So, what we've done, it's in our name. That being said, I do want to reinforce the fact that we are all in on Kubernetes. You guys have seen what we've done with Project Pacific, and it's a top to bottom, literally re-architecture of vSphere around Kubernetes. deep into the bowels of VSX in terms of the runtime optimizing for containers, up to vCenter integration of its control plane with the Kubernetes control plane. So we are all about that, and leaning really forward into that. And I think that's actually a good thing. So let's talk about some of the different ways that we help customers in that transition. So the first thing we talk about is, you'll hear us saying it a lot, this notion of migrate and then modernize. When we see people want to go to the cloud, typically that is a number of things. It's, yes, I want to run in the public cloud, so migration to the cloud, but also there's a modernization of the workload to be more cloud native in architecture and so forth. And oftentimes people try to do all that at once, keep the old stuff on-prem, rewrite it from scratch up in the cloud, and this takes forever. There's all sorts of problems. And so, we are like saying, hey, like you can now instead migrate the apps untouched up to the cloud. You can do that, like we talked about, automated with HCX. And then you're there in a modern cloud environment with modern underlying infrastructure, cloud infrastructure. And that makes it much easier. So you can spin up and down hosts at will, as we just talked about. We have Kubernetes built in there. There's a whole bunch of native cloud services that are now there you can start taking advantage of. And so this pattern of sort of extraction of taking a monolith, instead of rewriting it all at once, which could take years, you take little bits and pieces of functionality out, develop a clean API against it, and then rewrite that against, as a microservices app. So concretely, it's like with Pacific, we now enable you to manage VMs with Kubernetes, right? So you can now, without having to do major rewriting, but start to get your feet wet with some of these Kubernetes capabilities. And it's not just the cloud native architecture, but it's also the DevSecOps process that you want to embrace there as well. And so being able to start doing that, leveraging Kubernetes and the Kubernetes ecosystem, the container ecosystem, with those existing apps, doing CI/CD, integration of different security elements there, and testing automations, etc. That's like another step in the direction. And so like you can start seeing that it's kind of this iterative process, migration, and then introducing CI/CD kind of seamlessly leveraging Kubernetes, but without still modifying the app heavily. And then the containerization process. So I don't know if we've announced this yet, but we are looking at how do we help automation going from a VM to a container. So there's a bunch of like kind of V2C type things out there. So that's something that we want to help with as well. And then finally, you look at all of our sort of Tanzu offerings, and that's really where we get into the microservices architecture. So leveraging Spring as helping out many enterprises using Spring, which has got a bunch of these turnkey elements for microservices, and Tanzu application service, Tanzu build service, service mesh capability. So you can start seeing how all these things become additive, that it's not a kind of all or nothing, but instead it's a iterative set of steps that you can take toward that vision that you want to get to. And I think really that's kind of our biggest differentiator. It's because we give you that sort of optionality in terms of how you want to modernize, and make it so you can get these kind of quick wins, if you will, while moving the ball forward. And then, as plans inevitably do, when they change, you can very quickly adapt to that as well. Some of that gives you a bit of a summary of how we look at it and how all these things fit together.
Right. I think my larger question is, you have such an intimate knowledge of how applications are actually functioning, because at the network layer, you have NSX that can inspect how applications are talking to each other.
Yep.
At the security layer, you're inspecting all the stuff that's happening on a virtual machine, and you could use that for more than just security. And you also have a toe in the storage layer. You know what's happening at that. So you could take all of that and go, okay, this application, these are the pieces that probably map best to this PaaS service on AWS, whereas this should really just be a containerized microservice. And this one, maybe that should just stay a VM. So is there anything in the works to build that kind of tooling?
So that's a good question. So you're right. We do have a lot of this very insightful information. I believe we are using it in various ways. I don't know if there's like a single effort where it all comes together yet. But it certainly seems like there is a big opportunity there, as you just talk about, right? So I think right now it's like, as I mentioned, there's a bunch of different things happening, and I think each of those are leveraging different pieces. And you're right. I think we still have some more work to do before we kind of bring it all together in a more unified whole. But, to be clear, I think if I look at it, one of our big goals is, again, if you look at the overall journey from, kind of app where it is today to glorious Nirvana future, perfectly re-architected, cloud native, etc. How much of this can we automate? In the end, there's going to be some manual work, like rewriting code. We haven't yet automated that. Maybe some people do. I don't know, like ML things and all that. But a lot of it, like the migration, we can automate. The conversion from a VM to container, we can automate. And so now you're saying, hey, like maybe if you look at actually how you start thinking about the app architecture and what that decomposition of functionality should look like as you go toward a set of microservices, we could actually help direct people there as well. So I think you're absolutely right. And that's kind of the direction we've been going, sort of building up and getting more maturity as we go. But clearly, still a lot more work to do there, a lot more opportunity in front of us.
Absolutely. Thank you.